Lake Effect brings you conversations about what's happening in Milwaukee and the people, places, and organizations that shape our community. This is Lake Effect Spotlight from WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR.
We'll start with a look at a bill that was introduced in the Wisconsin Legislature by Democratic legislators and environmental groups last month. It's called the Climate Accountability Act, and it's proposing cutting Wisconsin's greenhouse gas emissions in half by 2030. Representative Supreme Moore Omokunde is one of the lead sponsors. It's also being spearheaded by Citizens Action of Wisconsin. Robert Craig is the executive director of that group. He and Representative Omokunde joined WUWM's environmental reporter Susan Bentz to share how they hope to get the bill passed in a divided legislature.
You talked about reducing greenhouse gas emissions 52% by 2030.
Yeah.
Is that the heart of the bill and saying let's work together to get to that goal?
Basically, it's that, and it also focuses on a racial and class equity as well. And I say racial and class equity because there's often this rural-urban divide that people create for whatever reasons they want to. Sometimes it's, if I can tell these people over here that the people over there are the reason that they're suffering or doing badly, it helps me win elections or helps me gain power, et cetera. But what we want to do is create a rural-urban bridge and make sure that what's happening in your communities over in this rural area is also happening and affecting folks in these urban areas. And there's more that you have in common than you have different. And so how do we create these bridges? One, we all live on the same planet. So what's happening in your area is going to happen in mine and vice versa. And we also want to talk about racial equity because we know that black and brown folks feel the brunt of climate change the most in certain areas in the city and state. And so we want to take that into consideration as we formulate any plan. And you have to do it at the front end because if you don't, those communities often get left to the wayside.
So, Robert Craig, do you see progress that gives you more hope that this bill could pass?
Yes. There was obviously in Milwaukee, the city did produce a strong climate and economic equity plan to put itself at the forefront of major cities in the country, and that was a long process. You've seen a lot of social movements, a lot of young people organizing and understanding that there is a climate crisis and there's a deadline by which we have to reduce emissions. What's frustrated us about the climate debate in the state legislature, this is, frankly, there's been lots of small bills that do some nice things, add some renewable energy, but you don't see how it adds up, and the public doesn't, and it doesn't. You could be introducing and passing these bills, and emissions still be increasing every year. What the science tells us, 98% of global scientists, immense global consensus, and it's where the public is. Public is moving on this. There's a public consensus. There's a climate crisis, and that it's immediate, and that we need to take the necessary action. It tells us we have to cut emissions in half within 5 years, by 2030, which means we have to cut it about 7.5% each and every year, and we have to hold ourselves accountable. So this bill tries to get us to the fundamentals. We can disagree on policy, but we have a deadline, and we have to put something together that achieves this. And the other thing we'll find in this debate, and this is the whole economic equality, racial equality part that Representative Moore Omokunde has been talking about, this isn't going to be costly. This is going to create a huge number of jobs, and it's going to reduce pollution directly and the consequences, all of the death and the chronic diseases caused by air pollution, for example. So this is a win-win proposition. It's within our technological means quite easily. It's a matter of getting our democracy to work and do what it needs to do. The idea of this bill is to force the right debate. The debate is to how to get there, not endless spinning our wheels on policy, because there actually is a deadline.
You were recently in Madison talking to both Democratic and Republican representatives and senators, I take it. Is that the conversation you have with legislators, and how receptive do you find that they are?
There are two levels. This is like a textbook on democracy. There's all the discussions Supreme can have with his colleagues, but then we brought members around the state, both to lobby on this and our health care priorities, to meet with their own legislators. And legislators are a lot more, I think, Supreme would agree, all ears when it's their own constituents sitting in the office. But I tried to be in many of those meetings as possible and go where the members needed support. And So we were getting that level. So there were some cases where people signed on because Supreme and the Senate sponsor, Senator Chris Larson, talked to people, and there are other times where I was able to text back, like to Supreme staff, Senator Smith will be signing on because a bunch of members just asked him to sign on in his office, and he agreed, just for example. So it's really having to do both levels, the small grassroots democratic level and then the legislative, leadership level.
Yeah, I think it's really important to have folks from the district coming into and advocating for whatever it is that they believe in, because on that day, no one can say that they didn't know about something, that they didn't hear about something. Because as legislators, when we want to dismiss something, the first thing we'll say is, well, nobody's calling me about this. Nobody's emailing me. Nobody came to visit me about this. And so this is just you trying to do something. However, when we have constituents calling, emailing, coming up to visit and advocating for whatever it is that they want, and they're from your district, on that day, no one can pretend that nobody came to talk to them. So it's definitely a battery in our back kind of situation.
So 2030 is not that far away. So when do you feel this bill, that the plan has to be set and it needs to move forward?
Well, as my colleague Chris Larson stated, that the best time to do this was 10 years ago. Yeah. The second best time to do it is right now. And so ASAP, we need to get something done. We need to have some dogged conversations within this session. We've just started. However, we need to have some dogged conversations. If folks are serious about what they've said, now is the time for accountability for those words. And so the olive branches have been extended, and we're hoping folks are gonna accept.
Let me just say that where the public is on this now is the public thinks there is a climate crisis, that we need to do something about it. The problem is the public's not been given a clear definition of who is for doing something and who isn't. So the virtuous circle of politics is you try to persuade people with democratic engagement during the legislative session, but you at least want to leave it clarified as to who blocked it so it can become an issue in elections. I think climate change is on the verge of becoming a top-tier electoral issue if you look at public opinion, but it needs clear definitions of who's on what side, and this bill helps provide that. So because there's a lot of, I supported this recycling plan, this solar array, and then it's not, but we're not looking at your whole record. Maybe you also increased emissions even more than those reduced it by other actions, right? This makes us stay serious to the goal. So I think we have to make democratic engagement work, but I think the public is ready and ripe for this. So it'll be a question of how far we can get this, but let's face it, if let's say nothing happens by 2030, it means that we've shot the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit. It means that the chance of feedback loops is even higher as far as carbon being released from the ocean, from ice, from forests, for example. But it's still, and it's irreversible, that amount of damage, but it's still going to be better to do as much as possible. It just means we're going to have to take even more drastic action. This could be done at a fairly reasonable pace of 7.5% a year. And there are things we have to look at, like we are right now for people getting solar power and energy conservation, fully weatherized homes, you know how we have older homes and we're in a colder climate, where it's up to each person. It's great we have all these tax credits, we'll see how long they last, that the Biden administration put through in the Inflation Reduction Act, but it's on each individual to figure out how they're going to do it, how to be financed, you know, how they line up the tax credits. Utilities in San Diego and in Georgia are going and building the solar on each person's house and putting batteries there and giving them and cutting them in on the savings, and therefore they're doing it to scale rather than building new big power plants. That's the kind of solution we're going to need to push for. I'm not saying that's the be-all and end-all. I'm saying that that's the kind of follow-up bills that should come from this debate, right? And so we have to have everything on the table, but it is affordable, technologically doable, and it'll also make this a more prosperous and more vibrant and a more equal state. It'll really help restore a lot of the union jobs that were lost with the decimation of manufacturing in the global economy.
So he mentioned federal funding that came through during the Biden administration. With or without federal funds, do you think that 2030 is achievable without?
Yes, I think it'll make it more difficult, especially given what the Inflation Reduction Act has done. However, it can still be done, and we'll have to do the work, and we have to agree to do the work.
I think with what's happening at the federal level, it just puts the onus back on the states because the science doesn't change. And major climate and environmental leaders are saying it's up to states to pick up the slack. There's still a lot of Inflation Reduction Act money out there that we need to take advantage of, but this administration is going to try to choke it off even quicker than we thought was legally possible. But there are very inexpensive pathways to doing this that are effective and will still produce a lot of jobs. I mean, putting solar panels on homes and weatherizing them is extremely labor intensive. So it's a trend and it can be union jobs. There's a major union contractor doing weatherization here in the central city of Milwaukee, for example. And there could be a lot more of that, but we need to give it a push with state policy.
What's next is we go and we talk to more people, and we start to have those tough conversations about what getting to our greenhouse gas emission levels look like. What do our carbon emissions level, what does that look like? And where are we able to continue to converge on our interests at? And what do we have to agree to disagree on, and what can we move forward on? What can we put into this plan? And so that's what's next. A lot of talking and conversation behind closed doors.
Supreme Moore Omokunde represents the 17th Assembly District in Milwaukee. Robert Craig is the Executive Director of Citizens Action of Wisconsin. They spoke with WUWM's environmental reporter Susan Bentz.
You can find more interviews like this one by visiting wuwm.com/Lake Effect. And while you're there, subscribe to the Lake Effect Spotlight podcast.